Canadians should be unapologetic about who we are and what we stand for. Canadian values are distinct and they are worth defending. Today, I speak to an elected official and a great Canadian who lives by these values. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show. Hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to True North. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think is great about Canada. If you're listening to this podcast, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review if you enjoy the podcast. So Canada is and always has been a great country. In a chaotic and destabilized world, Canada stands for peace, for freedom, for hope and opportunity, based on a tradition of rights and responsibilities that date back over 8 centuries. We've never been a country defined by creed, ethnicity, or even a shared religion. Instead, we are united by our ideals, our values, namely our commitment to freedom, to peace, order, and good government, to pluralism, and to Canadian patriotism. A few weeks ago, I wrote a column about how Canada needs to get serious and start a conversation about our values and how to defend them and what it means to be Canadian. This is especially true against a backdrop of a postmodernist education system that promotes gloom and nihilism and, frankly, hatred of Canada, and with practically an open border immigration policy that welcomes millions of newcomers without any expectation that they will integrate, that they will embrace Canadian values, that they will adopt a Canadian identity, and without requiring them to leave their tribalistic feuds and hatreds from the war-torn countries that they fled, the failed countries that they fled, leave them behind. Well, shortly after I wrote that column, someone sent me a speech that was given in Queen's Park, Ontario's provincial legislature. It was a female elected official giving a remarkable speech about what Canada means to her, and how, sadly, some of the worst instances of tribalism and bigotry that she left behind in the Middle East have followed her to Canada. I'm going to play part of that clip for you right now because I think it's so fantastic and something that all Canadians should see. So this is Ottawa area MPP Goldie Ghamari on October 23rd, 2023.
You know, Madam Speaker, when my parents immigrated to Canada in 1986, I was a year old. And the reason that they immigrated to Canada from Iran is because in 1979 there was an Islamic revolution, and our once free and democratic country was taken over by radical Islamists. So my parents escaped in 1986 because they wanted to live in a free and democratic society. And I was a year old at the time. And we were blessed to be able to come to Canada to escape that hatred, to escape that radical, fundamentalist, Islamophobic ideology. And so when we came to Canada, my parents raised myself and my younger sister, always telling us how blessed we are to be Canadian. And we should always put Canada first. Never forget your heritage, never forget your culture, never forget your background, but always remember that you are first and foremost a proud Canadian. And what that means, Madam Speaker, is you come here to embrace culture and diversity and accept people for who they are, and you leave the problems of your home country behind.
Always remember that first and foremost, you are a proud Canadian. What a beautiful sentiment for immigrant parents to teach their young children. Really, truly a remarkable speech. Goldie Ghamari is a progressive, conservative Ontario member of the provincial parliament representing the riding of Carleton. Prior to being elected in 2018, she was an international trade lawyer and commercial litigator. She was born in Iran, as she mentioned in that clip, and her family escaped the Islamic regime and came to Canada. She has been dedicated to fighting against the radical Islamists who run the Iranian regime, and she's been particularly vocal in recent weeks as we've seen some pro-Hamas activists taking to the streets in protests across the country. So Goldie Ghamari, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And you corrected me on the pronunciation of your last name. I thought it was Ghamari, but it's Ghamari, so my apologies for that.
That's okay, no worries. Actually, it's funny, my sister and I sometimes use the code word Ghamari as like a little password. So we use that in the past for like one of our Wi-Fi passwords. So yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, well, I wanted to start by asking about that remarkable speech that you gave on October 23rd. So why don't you just tell us what compelled you to deliver those marks? And specifically, why did you talk about how your parents always taught you to put Canada first? Do you think that's a common sentiment amongst newcomers to Canada, that they put Canada first?
So, I mean, when I stood up, I wasn't really sure what I was going to say. I didn't have anything planned out. I just knew that I wanted to speak because it was an issue that's of such importance to me. And um, you know, ever since my speech, I've received emails from hundreds of people, not just in my riding of Carleton, but across Ontario and across Canada. Many of them newcomers, or immigrants from previous years, who said that they share the exact same sentiment as me. Because I think, the majority of people, including my parents, immigrate to Canada because they want a better life, because they recognize and they understand the um, possibilities that a country like Canada provides, the potential futures that Canada provides, the opportunities that Canada provides. And that happens because of the way Canadian society is structured. And so, that's why people like my parents immigrate here, is to uh, become part of that community, to embrace those Canadian values, and to raise their children Canadian.
Well, that's wonderful, and I'm very pleased to hear that you got that reaction and that so many Canadians felt the same way. In your speech, you also were very critical of the pro-Palestine rallies that we've been seeing. You mentioned that have been genocidal chants. What do you think we should make of these? What do you think Canada should do when protests are not advocating for peace, instead when protests sort of turn nasty and start advocating for terrorism and for groups like Hamas who promote genocide?
Well, the Canadian government has made it very clear that hate rallies have no place in Ontario. Um, I know that the Prime Minister has said something similar, but then he's kind of gone back and forth on it, and hasn't been very clear on where he stands, which is a little bit unfortunate, because I think, any sort of chants or behaviors or marches or rallies that promote hate or terrorism have no place in Canada and don't belong in Canada. It's unfortunate. I know that the previous federal government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper introduced a piece of legislation that would have made the glorification of acts of terror illegal in Canada, but Justin Trudeau repealed that, or didn't allow it to go through. So unfortunately, right now, there's this loophole that allows certain groups to make certain genocidal chants, or to shout things like Khaybar or Gas the Jews, or, we heard about that imam in Montreal who was preaching off of a balcony to 20,000 people at a pro-Palestine rally. And in that sermon, he's basically saying, kill the Zionists. I mean, how is that even Canada? Like that's the kind of behavior you would see in like a radical Islamophobic country, like the terrorist Islamic regime in Iran. Like you don't see that in Canada. That's the kind of behavior that my parents immigrated from immigrated to Canada to get away from, right? Like, we know what that behavior is. We see that in Iran all the time, unfortunately, because the behavior that we're seeing right now in Canada, certain behaviors, certain very anti-Semitic ideologies or chants, these all stem from ideology that's been perpetrated and exported by the terrorist Islamic regime in Iran, a regime that denies the Holocaust, a regime that is incredibly anti-Semitic, a regime that constantly says that they're going to eradicate the Zionist regime. And we're seeing those exact same talking points here in Canada in 2023.
It's interesting. You've been exposing and ringing the alarm bell about Islamists, and specifically regime members, people from the Islamic regime in Iran, living in Canada, able to go about their business. It's interesting because back under, again, the previous federal Harper government, Canada expelled the Iranian diplomats that ended diplomatic ties. Trudeau has sort of been warmer and softer, but it's still very surprising to me that there would be senior members, of the regime living in Canada, able to just sort of carry on their business without being bothered. The other day, we saw a rally where someone was waving an Islamic Republic flag. You know, I've seen many people wave Persian flags, the same colors, but instead of the Islamic Republic logo, a lion. But I hadn't seen that sort of the Ayatollah's flag in Canada before. It was really sort of chilling. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the research that you've been doing and what Canada ought to do about regime members living in our country?
So there was a global news special that came out a couple weeks ago from an Iranian reporter named Nigar Mojtahidi, and she had done a very in-depth review and research on Islamic regime sympathizers and people from Iran who sympathize with the Islamic regime who are in Canada. And there's currently at least 700 known Islamic regime sympathizers who are in Canada. And Trudeau has done nothing about that. And like you said, a lot of them come here and live these free lives in Canada and enjoy the benefits of being in a Canadian society after everything they've done in Iran. And I think part of the reason, I mean, I can't prove this, but my educated guess would be part of the reason why they're able to come here is money, whether they're sort of economic immigrants or, you know, I would just say in that case, the easiest answer is to follow the money. What we can do, what Justin Trudeau could do if he actually wanted to, is to put the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is basically the ruling party, to put everyone involved in the IRGC on the Canadian terror list. What that would do is that immediately ban anyone from coming to Canada, whether as on a visitor basis or permanent resident, permanent basis. It would also ban all commercial activities, and any assets that were in Canada would be frozen. So it would, provide an economic sanction within Canada right away. And it would definitely give more ability and more weight for authorities to go after those who are in Canada who are affiliated with the Islamic regime in Iran. But Justin Trudeau has not done that. We don't know why. This is something that the Iranian Canadian community has been calling for several years, most notably in the past almost 4 years now, since the Islamic regime shot down Ukraine flight PS752 back in January of 2020. Initially, when they did that, they said the Islamic regime blamed it on Canada and the United States, saying that this was some sort of Zionist conspiracy theory. And one thing you'll notice with the Islamic regime is everything to them is a Zionist conspiracy theory. So for the first 3 days, the Islamic regime claimed that this was Canada and the United States and a Zionist conspiracy cover-up. But after 3 days, when more and more social media footage was emerging showing what actually happened, the Islamic regime finally had to acknowledge that they themselves had shot down Ukraine flight PS752, killing 55 Canadians on board, as well as 30 permanent residents who were among the 176 passengers and crew who were all basically murdered when the plane was shot down. So ever since then, Iranians have been trying to get the IRGC on the terrorist list, and Justin Trudeau refuses. We still don't know why he refuses to put the IRGC on the terrorist list. What I do know is that one of his MPs, an Iranian MP actually from Richmond Hill, Majid Johari, back in 2016, initiated a petition to try and reestablish diplomatic relations with the terrorist and illegitimate Islamic regime in Iran, which made no sense to the Iranian Canadian community. And that actually left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, a lot of Iranian Canadians' mouths. And there's a lot of people who took offense and took issue with that MP trying to reestablish diplomatic negotiations and reopen the Iranian embassy in Canada. So that might also provide a hint as to why Trudeau won't put the IRGC on the terrorist list.
I believe that's the same MP who, during a large round of protests, Iranians in Canada and around the world were protesting the regime's crackdown on civilians, on children, all kinds of things. I believe that's the same MP who told Canadians to respect the democratically elected government of Iran. He later had to walk that back because obviously there's no kind of democracy or elections in Iran. Goldie, I wanted to ask you just a final question. We're seeing a lot of protests, a lot of rallies in Canada. Some of these protests border on being sort of openly pro-Hamas, openly promoting very barbaric practices and ideologies. And I think it's hard for many Canadians to sort of walk the line of what is considered Islamophobic and what is considered legitimate criticism of extremism or even promotion of terrorism. I know you recently tweeted about how you're a sort of strong advocate of women's rights in the Middle East, but that you failed to make a distinction between extremist practices and the broader Muslim faith. So I'm wondering if, from your perspective, where is that distinction? Because the term Islamophobia is a bit murky. It's not always clear what is meant by it. And some people interpret it as being a criticism of Islam, which is meant to be banned. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So my tweets have always been within the context of the terrorist and illegitimate Islamic regime in Iran. And, I always refer to it as Islamofascism as opposed to Islam or Muslims. I can see how sometimes some of the things I say, when I take it out of context, could be referred to or could be interpreted as that you're referring to everyone. The challenge is, at this point, I'm not quite really sure what is considered Islamophobic and what isn't. I was reading a recent article where I know the CRA is attempting to audit a couple of, I guess, Muslim nonprofits or Muslim charities. And one of the advocacy groups was arguing that the CRA attempting to audit these Muslim groups is Islamophobic. And that's a argument they made to a judge in Canada. Now, I don't think the judge bought that argument, didn't buy the claim that CRA attempting to audit a Muslim group is Islamophobic. But I think it just shows the challenge of trying to criticize certain radical ideologies and then, being painted with this brush. I think it's just very important that any criticism of any religion, it should always be made very clear that, this isn't you're not painting the entire community, you're not painting the entire practice, you're just talking about something very specific. So, for example, one of the criticisms I have made is that, to me, it makes no sense that the United Nations voted to have the terrorist and illegitimate Islamic regime in Iran, which is an Islamofascist dictatorship, have them be the head of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Like, to me, it just doesn't make sense. And I don't think to any rational person, it wouldn't make sense that a brutal dictatorship that murders and hangs children in the name of Allah, by the way, that's what they do. That's why they're Islamofascists, because they use religion to legitimize their fascist behavior. And there's actually a term for it in Farsi. In Farsi, we refer to Islamofascism as vilayat faqih. And that's a whole other episode that we could go into. But essentially, what it does is it gives the supreme leader the divine authority to dictate anything that they want in the name of Allah. So, to me, it makes no sense that you have this Islamofascist dictatorship who hangs children, be the head of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So to me, my personal opinion is that we have these international humanitarian organizations or institutions that seem a little bit compromised, right? Like, how could you not be compromised when you have people voting for the Islamic regime in Iran to be the chair of the Human Rights Council? So I think it's just a matter of being very, very clear and succinct in the criticisms in order to make sure that people understand the context.
Absolutely. And I think you're completely right about the UN, I recently saw someone on social media post a picture of an individual who was both a member of UNRWA, which is the United Nations branch that focuses on refugees in Palestine, who also happened to be a member of Hamas. So he was both. And I think that kind of shows the compromise there. Well, Goldie, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all your effort. I know you have such a big following out there. So many people look at you and admire the work you do and admire your voice and your strength. So thank you so much for taking the time, and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me on anytime. I'm sorry, I think I ran it on a little bit too much, but happy to come back anytime and talk.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. That's Goldie Ghamari, an MPP in Ontario. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.